indeed a pleasure for us to present our program. To introduce our speaker, I asked Lieutenant Colonel Moore, who is an old friend of Captain Langer and who was instrumental in arranging this entire program. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Lieutenant Colonel Moore to come on up and to introduce our speaker, Captain Hans Langer.
Ladies, guests, companions, we're here to hear from a person who was on the stage of history when important strides in military history and aviation were being made. He's a contemporary of mine in that we participated in the same air battles over Europe. We came from the shadows of history. We come from the shadows of history of a half-century past. By the parachute, the fates have allowed us to pass from youth to middle age and beyond. In our time and place, we did our duty with honor as Providence gave us to see our honor. I present to you a distinguished aviator, individual, and fellow citizen, Mr. Hans Langer.
I will have to tell you, so I will read it to you. I will first tell you today about the importance of air power and the roles that fighters played in the Second World War. Because for the first time, and the last in history, great air armadas were involved. The greatest struggle for the controls of the skies ever took place. The involvement of such masses of airplanes was never done before and will never be done again. So looking back, we can see that fighter pilots had their great days during that war, because fighters, by controlling the skies above, determined the outcome and fate of strategic and tactical land and sea campaigns. They enabled great bomber fleets to carry their struggle deep into enemy homeland on a very often devastating scale, or prevented such onslaught from the other side. This was a striking shift in the use of air power from the First War. And it was most dramatically demonstrated in the Battle of Britain, when RAF fighters stopped daylight bombing by the Luftwaffe, and by doing so, prevented an onslaught, prevented the invasion of an otherwise weakly defended Britain. The German invasion of Norway in June 1940, also fighters played a decisive role. The Luftwaffe soon gained control of the seas within the range of their bases and won the battle of reinforcement and supply. The various warring nations adopted different concepts of employment of the air arms. Germany and Russia emphasized that of army cooperation. The US and Britain, learning this technique later and employing it, particularly in the breakthrough at Saint-Cloud in France, developed the strategic concept of using the air arm. The Russian concept was similar to the Germans, although Russia never developed an effective bomber. The air battle of Germany was the greatest struggle of the war, and one of two most critically decided by fighters. It was fought by three air forces: the RAF, the US 8th, 9th, and 15th, and the Luftwaffe, which employed against such onslaughts conventional day and night fighters, the first jet and rocket-propelled airplanes, and a variety of other experimental weapons. In terms of numbers participating in the Battle of Germany, there's never before and will never again be duplicated. The fighter conflict was most important. It was not uncommon to be attacked during the day by 12 to 1,500 heavies and 600 to 700 fighters, and revisited the following night by the RAF. But the losses for both the U.S. and the RAF were high. The Germans put high priority production on night fighters, and some of the best pilots were sent to those squadrons. Together with new radar techniques, it was not uncommon that on some nights 90 heavies were brought down. The outstanding lesson that was learned was that neither day nor night deep penetration could be carried out without the protection of long-range fighters. Both the RAF and the Luftwaffe had to abandon daylight bombing offensive earlier in the war because of prohibitive losses at the hands of defending fighters. When American bombers arrived in England, according to German sources in 1943, there was considerable disagreement between American and British planners as to the feasibility of the proposed daylight bombing campaign. The Americans insisted that the heavily defended fortress flying in boxes would prove up to the test. As it turned out, those boxes were more formidable than other formations, but they could not roam the sky over Germany at will without fighter escort. So it was not until the arrival of later models P-51, P-47, and P-38s that the tide began to turn. Neither British nor German fighters could approach the endurance performance of those aircraft. Without those escorts, the attack force suffered usually very heavy losses. And for the first time, bomber losses, direct and indirect, were 19% of the attacking force. On a raid to Schweinfurt in August of 43, over 60 went down, and more than 100 were heavily damaged. The German fighter losses were 25. Those and other attacks convinced also then the U.S. planners that daylight bombing without escort was too costly and could not be sustained over a longer period of time. However, the offensive was not called off because of the arrival of long-range fighters in great numbers in England that saved that situation. What is often not realized is that only because of German planning lapses and organizational failures was the Luftwaffe to do better than it did. It was not until 1944 that fighter production in Germany became adequate, and at that time there were no longer first-class fighter pilots available in any numbers. And green Luftwaffe formations were, like on some occasions, totally shut up. Like a newly formed Fighter Group 51 in central Germany in a place called Magdeburg, where 45 airplanes were lost on one intercept mission. Allied fighters had won air superiority, and overall the fighter farm of the Luftwaffe did not do too badly in the Battle of Germany until the very last, when Allied fighters shot up airfields and aircrafts on the ground and in the air almost at will. The only way the Luftwaffe could have won this battle was to inflict losses so high that the offensive had to be called off. And this the German fighter pilot was unable to do, and the battle was lost. This is just a foreword to give you an idea of the situation in Germany when I became a fighter pilot. I was schooled to be an aerodynamist, and at the age of 19, in 1941, at the end of 1941, I was drafted in the Air Force. I had already gone through pilot schools in my training previously, and I became a fighter pilot. At the beginning of 1942, we were sent to North Africa, And at the first day that we arrived there, the field in Cape Bon in Tunis was strafed by P-38 fighters. And we were on the way, and we were pretty high, so we thought we joined the circus, and we went down and had some fun with them. And I was pretty cocky, and I felt I was in charge of the situation. I flew wing with a very knowledgeable pilot, and it didn't last 5 minutes. And I had a P-38 behind me, and I took hits in the engine and had the belly land at the airport. That was my arrival in North Africa. About 3 days later, we took some fighter bombers to Benghazi, and we tangled with a group of Spitfires, and I had one behind me, and of course I couldn't outturn the Spitfire, and my leading edge slots boat came out, and the fellow was right behind me, and I was told that as long as you can look in the guns of the other airplane, nothing is going to happen, because if you're in a turn, the fire will go past you behind. But if you see the belly, then you have a problem. All of a sudden, the Spitfire turned in. I did see the belly. I pushed in the rudder and went up, and then fell down again and went through his fire. And I started to burn right away. We were at about 25 or 30,000 feet, pretty high, and I bailed out. And would you believe that I hit a cactus? There was only one there in the whole area, and I happened to hit it. I swung fore and back, and bingo, there I went in. And it took some folks quite a while to peel all the thorns out of my back end. But the interesting part was that an Arab showed up after a while, and he was on a donkey. And he apparently was told by British Empires that if you ever bring a pilot back, you will get rewarded. And we had a little prepared green identification card, and it's in Arabic, but you would have to tell him. And if he is really in a bad mood, then you just try to touch his clothing and mention Ana Dakhilak. That's a call on his religion, and he would have to take you where you wanted to go. But it didn't come to that. We argued a little bit. He spoke a little German all of a sudden when I mentioned money. And we argued, and he said, okay, I'll take you. So he did, but then he wanted me to walk, and I thought that was pretty uncomfortable. First we had to pay him, and then I had to walk. Of course, I didn't feel like sitting either. But I ended up back again where I belonged. And a couple of days later, I had my first P-40, a Tomahawk, or Kitty Hawk, as we called the machine at that time. And the pilot bailed out, and we landed, and I took a picture of him, and he had beautiful cowboy boots, and he enjoyed my tennis shoes. We flew in tennis shoes and shorts because of the heat there. And so I talked him into it, and he lived with us for at least 4 or 5 days that I know of, and ate with us. And of course I couldn't communicate with him. We had an interpreter. But he sold me his cowboy boots, and I gave him my tennis shoes. And I flew with those cowboy boots all the time in the African campaign. I lost them in Sicily a little later on. So that was the time in North Africa. And I'm sure this gentleman who flew P-38s there in this area, it was more or less a fighter pilot's war. We tangled with the machine. We didn't care. When the pilot had a problem, or when you saw that there was a problem, we let him bail out. The same happened to me. I had never seen during that time any hostility against a person. It was just the airplane. and it had other identifications than we had. After the North African campaign came Sardinia and Sicily. Of course, I could tell you stories how I got to Sardinia, but this would probably be much too long because I have some other things that I would like to tell you. But the Americans came from the west, the British came from the east, and we got squashed in Tunis and Cape Bon, in that area. And in order to get out of the place, it was next to impossible because we couldn't fly, we didn't have any fuel. The airplanes were blown up. The few airplanes that carried gasoline from Italy to North Africa, there were 50 Junkers transports in the morning, and we couldn't escort them. And of those 50, I think 48 got shut down. And in the afternoon, the same story happened with the other 50. And the tragic thing of that transport, of that ferrying the gasoline from Italy to North Africa in order to save our back, all the cans and all the canisters had water in it. You didn't even carry gasoline. And where the water was, the gasoline was switched, nobody knew. It could have been done in Foggia, could have been done in Italy somewhere. But all those people lost their lives because they carried water to North Africa. So we had to blow up the airplanes. And I took a license airplane at night and just took off. I didn't know, I had a mechanic with me, and I didn't know whether this thing was fueled or not. This airplane was capable of 4 hours flight, but I was unaware that it was fully fueled, which it was. And I ended up in Sardinia, flying very low over the water, and it was quite an experience because every time you thought there was land, the moon had fooled you. And so you flew towards that, and it was nothing but a cloud. So it was just touch and go, and eventually I ended up there. And I landed in Sardinia in the middle of a minefield because the coast was mined, and we too were so exhausted, we dropped this thing down on the beach and fell asleep. And in the morning we had heard noises, and those people on the sand dunes, screamed. Eventually we understood that this area was mined. So they picked us up then out of this minefield. Anyway, Sicily came next, and then came the invasions at Naples, which I participated in, and then the one at Anzio Beach. And when Anzio took place, we were north of Rome, and we battled a variety of folks there that flew 47s, mainly fighter bombers, very little heavy engine equipment we had to contend with, more twin engines, type of Marauder types or B-26s, A-20s, this type of thing. And everything transpired very fast there, and I was not very successful. We were transferred then a little later on to a place called Niš in Yugoslavia, where we caught the 24s that went to Ploest, to the oil fields in Ploest. And of course that was a disaster for the attacking bombers. They not only lost their lead navigator, I believe, on the way over, and they attacked the target from the wrong direction, and but we didn't have too many people there. Is that correct? And so mostly Italian, Romanian folks that flew 109s attacked that force. We had only the second group of Fighter Squadron 51, the one I was in, that came from Nice, and we picked them up on the way over and picked them up on the way back. So they had considerable losses there. Lots of airplanes ended up in Turkey and or in areas that were further south, like the Persian Gulf area. And others went back to Italy or back to Benghazi, where some of them came from. In the meantime, since my schooling, up until I was drafted, consisted of being schooled in aerodynamics, I was called upon to test some of the new equipment that was available in Germany. And at first, the first time I saw a twin-engine jet was in March of '43. The aircraft had a tail wheel at that time. It did not rest on a nose wheel. It had two power plants mounted in pots underneath the wings. The engines were by Junker's design, and they developed approximately 1,800 pounds of thrust, static thrust. And the aircraft was swept wing design. The leading edge was swept 15 degrees backwards, the trailing edge forward. And I was told by some engineers of what this aircraft was capable of doing and what it was doing. And with that instruction that I was given, I made some taxi tests, and then became the moment that I was to get airborne, which was quite an experience. To start the engines was rather difficult. You had to use both hands, right and left, and the engine was started first by a two-stroke gasoline engine to bring the turbine up to speed, approximately 2,500 RPM. And the turbine RPM indicator had an inner ring that went to 3,000, an outer ring that went from 3 to 14. And the idea was to get the turbine going with the gasoline motor until you had 3,000, then you injected the fuel, and you had an idling jet engine. And then you could advance the throttle very slowly in order not to burn out inject too much fuel and to burn out the turbine, which was very critical at that time because of the material that were not available to us, the titanium especially that was used for the turbine blade. The engine was an 8-stage axial turbine. Injection was done from the top and the bottom. So after the taxi test, then came the time that I had to let loose and get this thing going. The visibility over the nose was horrendous. You couldn't see a thing. The nose was quite big. The fuselage was of triangular design, a very beautiful airplane. But you just, with this long nose, had no visibility whatever on takeoff and landing. And when I accelerated, the turbine speed went up to 8,700 on both sides. And I was told to look out at the onions or orifice on each side of the engine. When they produced, then you were in business. You could go. You could advance the throttles a little slowly forward to 8,700 RPM, at which time you had full power. If you didn't do that, it was possible, and it happened to some of the folks that you lost this orifice, and when this happened, then raw fuel got injected and you had a fire. And there were no fire indications as such, or they were very slow moving, so by the time you reached a V1 speed and you had a fire warning on, then, and you had to shut this engine down, there was no way that you could get airborne with that little amount of thrust, because the aircraft weighed about 14,000 pounds, empty. And we carried about a considerable amount of kerosene, which consisted of 87 octane gasoline and a 5% mixture of oil, simple oil, a crude way of making kerosene. So I went down the runway. I had indicated about 100 miles or 160 kilometers, and the tail would not come up. There was no way that I could get the tail up. I had to brake the airplane physically, and the German brakes were, I don't know whether you know or not, they were not known for being very powerful. They were all toe-type brakes. And when I applied the brakes and pushed the stick forward, the tail came up, but only under those conditions, which was the least to say very hurrying. At that time, I could have some visibility. I had reached about 160 kilometers, about 100 miles, and at about 110 miles, the airplane, you could lift the nose up, and it flew. That was critical, I was told, to retract the gear right away. In fact, the takeoff was done with a 20-degree flap deflation, and as soon as you got airborne, you raised the flaps to 10 degrees, and you could see that on markers on each side of the wing. And so the idea was to get the gear in and to get the flaps to 10% in order to, and push the nose down in order to gain some speed to maintain or to come to about 290 kilometers. That is probably burned into every 262's pilot mind. That was the critical single engine speed. 280 kilometers, if you had lost an engine, you lost the airplane and yourself. So 290 was the trick. So you pushed it down a little bit, got to that speed, and from then on, it was a dream. This thing accelerated. You could see the airspeed indicator go up, and by the time I had the airplane cleaned up, I was probably about 4,000 meters, about 19,000 feet. I had concentrated on the instruments, and that was the first time that I could look outside. I had gotten myself lost. I was that far away from the familiar surroundings of the airport. And I had to get a DF steer in order to get back to the field. And there came the second surprise. The voice that I heard answering me was so clear as I am talking to you now. The old spark noise was gone. There was absolutely nothing. There was no noise. It was just air rushing by. And you felt like you were being shut out and felt totally free. A beautiful, wonderful flight. The flight lasted 28 minutes. By the time I returned, the landing was accomplished with no problems. The aircraft was equipped with leading-edge slots, automatic slots. That means if the airspeed goes down to a certain degree, then the attitude of the aircraft gets changed. It gets an attack angle of about 8%. By that time, the flaps come out and give you a different profile to keep the wings from stalling, particularly the tips. So this is all I had to do. And that speed was about 160 miles. With an 8% angle of attack, carried about 40% power. By the time I got over the fence, I dropped the flaps to 60, cut the power to 25%. This thing settled there, just beautiful in a three-point landing. Of course, once you were down, you couldn't see anything again. So this changed then, and I went back to the front line and made my reports and what I saw. And the next time I had a chance was again a 262, but this time it was a much developed and much improved aircraft. And the idea for me was to establish a critical Mach number at which this aircraft could technically be operated at. The engines were improved. We used the JADO bottles for takeoff, which had a built-in parachute in the nose that were dropped after takeoff, and the parachute inflated, brought the JADO bottle back down again, could be reused. The aircraft was much improved. And at that time, it was at the end of 1943, beginning of 1944. at a place called Lechfeld in the southern part of Bavaria. And the idea was, as I said, to redline the airspeed on this aircraft before it was given to Luftwaffe pilots for training. And I took off with the bottles, with the JATO bottles, but I didn't need them on takeoff. The idea of the JATO bottles was because if you had a heavy loaded aircraft, the aircraft carried 4 30mm cannons, 100 rounds of ammunition on top and 60 on the bottom, and various other heavy things that you almost needed with a little bit of trust that you had, some assurance from another source that you get airborne. And they were quite well. They were very, very, very well. So we went to 10,000 meters, which is about 39,000 feet over the Alps, and conducted my testing. And I understood that I was told, I still say that today, that I was to use a bottle, one JATO bottle, with a slight negative angle of attack. So by the time I leveled off, I indicated we had an airspeed corrected, an altitude corrected airspeed indicator in. But I indicated 960 kilometers, which comes to about 590 miles. And I pushed the airplane slightly down. By the way, the engines at that time were impossible to restart above 25,000 feet because the air was so thin you couldn't restart them at that altitude. You had to be lower than that. So I shot this JATO bottle, and the thing that I heard was a very high frequency banging in the back of the cockpit. So I turned around, and by the time I turned around, I was probably, the Mach meter indicated Mach 0.6, 0.8.6, 0.86. That I remember. I turned around, the JATO bottle had left loose, it burned 60 seconds, and I went very close to Mach. I turned around, and by that time, the fuselage rear end had twisted off because the compressibility going to or at this Mach had twisted the tail end off. The tail end just came off. It gave a tremendous crack, and the tail went. And I started to oscillate all over the sky. Of course, it came right back again. I collected my critical instruments. They were of snap type, and put them in zipper pockets that I had in my pants, and prepared to get out of this thing. I oscillated so back that the G meter indicated almost 8 Gs by the time I was aware of what had transpired. So I got rid of the canopy, and it didn't last too long. I was afraid that the effect of the air on me would do great damage, but it didn't. And that was surprising. So either I had lost so much velocity by going sideways, slipping actually, that I was below that critical speed that would have done damage to me. So I free fell for about a minute, then pulled the chute and went down. That was all. That was all there was to it. So we redlined the airplane from then on at the Mach number of 0.82, where it was tactically feasible to operate this machine. You could go higher, but the problem was that the endurance of this aircraft was quite limited. It depended on the altitude, as today's jet aircraft, of how long you could stay in the air. Fighter guidance was not that good that you could be guided with the minimum amount of fuel to a bomber formation and then attack it. Second problem was that even with an altitude advantage over the bomber of, let's say, 5,000 feet or so, you had very much problems in order to get rid of your speed, because you were always at the critical Mach. You could not, you had to circle around the formation and around and around. We disregarded fighters altogether. We didn't even bother with them. But you had to go around the formation in order to get rid of your speed. By the time you got down to the bombers, you were so low on speed that you had to get back home. Because you had to have a little bit of reverse, because as it was almost always the case, the field where you took off from was just covered by 47s and 51s. They were just sitting there waiting. Now what the Germans did was they used a propeller-driven airplane at that time called a Focke-Wulf D9 model, a long-nosed Focke-Wulf. And that airplane could be compared with the 51. And they also had the quadruple 20-millimeter stationed on each corner of the field that just shot a barrage up. And we circled in and got down reasonably well at times, not so well. That was flying jets at that time. I went back to the front line. I flew 109G fighters and H fighters then in Germany for quite a considerable time. And then I had the chance to land at a field in northern Germany called Husum, where we already had established a rocket base with rocket airplanes called the Comet, Messerschmitt 163. The idea of those fighters were that they would form a ring around a critical target, like synthetic oil fields in middle Germany, and they would go up when the bombers were in sight and do their job and go back down again. The idea was good, but I think the airplane was more dangerous to the pilot than it was to the bombers. And I landed for fuel at this particular field up there in northern Germany on an intercept rate of bombers going to Berlin. And an old friend of mine happened to be the commander of this particular squadron there, and I talked him into to let me fly this aircraft. And because I wasn't allowed at that time anymore to fly anything other than 262s and 109s. He didn't let me go on a rocket airplane. So the training, pilot training on this Comet aircraft was such that the machine was towed by a propeller airplane, empty, not fueled, to an altitude so the pilot could get a feel of the airplane, because he had to go back exactly to where he came from. He had to put a big white cross out, and you had to land on the same spot or in the same vicinity. So we got some tows, empty tows, which were, there were no special precautions for this towing. I had flown gliders before, and I was pretty well aware of powered, unpowered flight, so I didn't have any problem there. I was towed up, and the airplane behaved very well. It's a tailless airplane. You couldn't find any complication or any odd behavior as far as flying characteristics were concerned. And then came the moment of a sharp start. The sharp start was when it was fueled up. The aircraft used hydrogen peroxide and hydrogen hydrate as a catalyst. The rocket motor was relatively light. It weighed 220 pounds. And the aircraft that I flew was a bi-fueled rocket, meaning that it had a second combustion chamber that could be used to extend the range and make it a little more usable as a fighter. Because the endurance on this aircraft was a little over 3 minutes, and the rocket fuel was gone. So with this bi-fuel type rocket, you could extend this time to about 7 minutes. You had to reuse, you had to restart in the second part. The peroxide, of course, was rocket fuel was very unstable, and you set between two tanks of this material. Then you had a large tank in front and one in the back, and the aircraft was anchored to the ground to test the system. Then the mechanics filled this up, and the pilots and the mechanics, they were dressed in an asbestos suit, because if anything could happen and this stuff ooze on you, then it had horrifying results. So the aircraft was fueled, and then it had draining cups on the bottom, where the rest was flushed out. It was flushed out with water. And when it got fueled up, then it looked like a rocket because it iced up right away. Aircraft sat on a dolly. Each aircraft had one dolly and had an hydraulic skid. And the hydraulic skid retracted when you operated the gear down lever. By doing that, the dolly fell free. And on the way back, you landed on a skid, on a sled. The seat was torsion sprung. It was capable of 20 Gs. Because it had to be that high, because normally you couldn't make a drop-in landing or a landing that was near to a stall speed, because you would surely, even with the torsion-sprung seat, break your back. So it had to be a fairly good high-speed landing. In my case, it worked out pretty well. I accelerated down the runway, the rocket motor started, and at about 140 miles or so, a little before, I had pretty good rudder action. Before, it oscillated quite a bit because of the construction of the dolly. And when I took off then, I dropped the dolly at about 30 feet, because if you dropped it too high, you lost it. And there was only one to each aircraft. If you dropped it too low, then it had a tendency of springing back, and when it didn't hit you on the bottom, you went together with the airplane. There was not a chance. You couldn't jettison the fuel, which was not a disadvantage, because of the considerable fire hazard and the corrosiveness of the rocket fuel. There were great precautions taken before you took off. They had a turnover vehicle parked on the other side of the field with a hoist that could lift the airplane straight again in case of a takeoff accident, that the aircraft overturned, because it was of utmost importance that the pilot got freed as soon as possible because of the corrosiveness of the fuel. And the asbestos suit was of no help. It was just a gimmick, I presume, to make you feel a little safer. And there was also an ambulance with a doctor and complete medical staff at the takeoff line. We had a tow vehicle that had a lift arm that retrieved the aircraft once it had landed. So those were great disadvantages for an aircraft being a fighter, because it had to be actually lifted off and towed back, and with all this precaution, it had to be restarted again. But that was the early part of rocket flight, and we're talking about 50 years ago or more. So in my case, the dolly dropped. The airspeed mounted very rapidly, I held it pretty flat, at a pretty flat angle, to about 2.5 or 3,000 feet, about 2,000 meters. And then you pulled the airplane straight up at an angle of 45 degrees, 45 to 50. And the airspeed indicator was just unbelievable. This thing went and went and went. And at about 15,000 feet, you got very close to Mach because of the thin air having an effect on the aircraft at this altitude. The airplane could not be overfueled, because if it was by as little as 200 pounds or so, you got shot up in excess of 40,000 feet. And it was not pressurized. So you can imagine that, and you almost had to use your rocket fuel in order to level off. So it was critical for the ground people that you didn't overfuel it. So you leveled off at about 39 to 40,000 feet. Put the airplane straight, at which time the rocket motor cut out. When that happened, you felt like you were shot against a cement wall. You were actually, the difference between the acceleration rate of you going up, leveling off, and the rocket engine cutting was unbelievable. You actually felt very much strain in your shoulder harnesses. You were pushed that much forward. The nose was very short, had a plexiglass bubble, and you felt like Munchausen sitting on a cannonball. It was absolutely quiet. With a little imagination during the daytime at this altitude, you could see stars and you could see the curvation of the Earth. I was a little in excess of 40,000 feet. Then came and at that time, when the engine cut, you were going about 8.4, 8.5 Mach. The airplane did not oscillate. It was quite stable at that Mach number. Now the idea now was, if it had become operational, which it was in a limited way, that the pilot would use this excessive speed with proper radar guidance to come under formation and then make the attacks. There were 3 ways of attacking a slow-moving target. That the pilot positioned this interceptor behind the bomber and pulled it straight up, looped through his own contrail, and made an attack from below. Or barreled through the formation, firing his slow-firing 108 cannons, 30-millimeter cannons. Of course, you had to be in almost a perfect marksman in order to do any result, because this particular cannon was relatively slow-firing, about 30 rounds a minute. Although you had 2 of them. And your closing speed was in the range of about 400 miles, the difference between the bomber speed and yours, that your chancing of hitting a target the size of a B-17 was quite remote. So this being recognized, at a little later time, an aircraft was modified, and I heard and saw this particular machine, whereby they mounted 108 cannon barrels upright in the wing root, 3 on each side. They were triggered by photoelectric cells in the leading edge of the wing, and all you had to do is make a high-speed pass underneath the bombers and do nothing. The cannon fired as soon as they got in the shadow of the photocell, and they didn't fire all at the same time. The first 2 barrels, a tenth of a second later, the second, because of the compression effect on the muscles, would have blown the canopy apart and the pilot's eardrums, I presume. But this thing apparently worked like a charm. I saw a picture whereby the pilot flew at a very high Mach number through 2 balloons that had sort of a cloth at top. strung on a wire. And he passed this thing, you heard a bang, and that was it. That class wasn't there anymore. And that was in April of 45. So you can imagine if even with the relatively rawness of the rocket engines at that time, of what potentials this machine had. So I came back pretty well, and I landed pretty well, and that was my first rocket flight, and it was quite an experience. I went back to the front, fighting bombers in Germany, and I was involved in quite a few, well, practically in all of those battles with the bombers. And at that time, our only chance to survive was a hit-and-run attack. We went above the formation, because you had to go through masses of fighter escort in order to get to the bombers. And by the time you got down, you had lost already a wingman or two, because the 47s were pretty knowledgeable too at that time, and they went higher than we did. This aircraft was pretty powerful, pretty strong and heavy, and they dashed after us, and we came on many occasions to situations where we had compressibility on propeller aircraft, where you had rudder reversals, and there wasn't a thing you could do. The Spitfire, the last model Spitfire, was famous for that. They were capable of going very close to Mach. And of course, then they had a rudder reversal, and instead of pulling, you had to push in order to get the airplane out of this dive. And it happened to me at one time over in Italy. We came from Udine, if that name means anything to you, northern Italy. And we caught back-flying B-24s and 38s. And we didn't see any, especially. And we were at pretty great height, around 39 or so 40,000 feet. And we were going south, four of us. And I had a feeling there was something that wasn't quite right. And I looked up, and there were contrails on top of me, and they were 38s. And they saw us, and they flew with us. And they just waited until we had to make a turn one time or another, because we had to go back up north again. They were going south. So I told them exactly what I was going to do. I had them all in the line, and as long as we were in the line, of course, nobody came down, because we could have avoided it. This is why we had the four-finger formation. But when I made the turn, that's when they made the move. And I had told my people exactly when I was going to initiate that turn, and I made a very shallow turn. The idea was that you made the turn, your other airplanes flies underneath, and the third and the fourth, and so you are coming out 180 degrees across in the same formation. Well, number 4 hung up, as usual. And the 38th just had a look at that, and their lead man just went after him. I went after him. 2 other 38s went after me. Then the 2 109s behind that. And I couldn't close in. It was right over Venice. And I couldn't close in on the 38 for nothing. I injected water, and I came a little closer, but I was still probably about 300-400 feet away. And at that time, he went into compressibility. And you could see it on his wingtips. He were going this and that, and he was almost frozen, and so was I. And I hit the cannon button, and his right wingtip came off. The airplane flipped around, went up, and I saw that, and he bailed out. Now I was number 1. 2 38s behind me. The 2 109s had disappeared. I don't know what he went. And there were a total of 4 38s. 1 bailed out. The other 2 were behind me, and the 4th I couldn't see either. And we just barreled down. And at that time, I had a compressibility. I couldn't move that stick for nothing, so I trimmed. One thing that I probably shouldn't have done, but I negatively trimmed the airplane. and I went around over the nose, came up on the other side. By that time, the 38s were gone. And I was hot. I was really feeling, either through the excitement, I was very hot. I took my hand and went over my face, and it was full of blood. So apparently the ice had come out of my socket. At the time, I was in this position, but it saved my skin. So this type of thing happened. And a little later then, we were going back to Germany and flew then the 262 jets. At which time we had come to a point whereby the Americans were about in Paris, the Russians were in the Budapest area, and we had problems finding a field, a suitable field in order to operate from. So we used the freeway. And the autobahns between Munich and Rosenheim was our favorite spot because we had forest areas right and left, and we could hide the airplanes in there because British mosquitoes came at night and they had a look and they shot everybody up, particularly the fuel trucks that came and tried to fuel the airplanes. And we tangled with everybody. So when we took off, we had Focke-Wulf fighters giving us cover so we could take off. Once we were in the air, they disappeared and we did our own thing. We hit the Russians mostly in the Prague area, and the devastation that we created with those 4 30 millimeters and 24 rockets under each wing was unbelievable. The Russians at that time approached the city of Prague with horses, with anything that moved, and we just went down and cleared the roads. And the destruction must have been fantastic because every time you let the rockets go, the street was entirely empty. And you came back and did that a couple of times. So they took immense losses there. And what was left over, when we went back, then we always found, at that time in southern Germany, the Marauder squadrons operated the twin-engine light bombers in masses there. And we didn't count shutdowns then anymore because we just walked into this situation and let the rockets loose and followed up with the cannons. And it was devastation in the highest degree. But we never lost an aircraft. I operated a squadron whereby every pilot had at least 40 shutdowns. And if he had survived that long, they were experts. They knew what they were doing, and you could depend on each of them. And so we didn't lose an aircraft, we didn't lose a pilot. And the end came then when we had to blow up the aircraft because of fuel shortage. And the Americans at that time were in Munich, and the Russians were in Salzburg, right on the other side, and the war was lost. Well, that's all I have to tell you. Just a short little story. I'd like to answer some questions, if I may. Yes, sir.
Hans, would you tell us about the B-47 at Rome Airport?
At Rome, yes. Yeah, we came we operated in the area of Anzio Beach, flying mostly escort to fighter bombers that went down to Anzio and went down to Monte Cassino. As you remember, the mountainous areas in Monte Cassino gave a lot of problems to the American ground troops. The Germans had apparently succeeded in establishing a defense line that was very tough to break. So we flew fighter escort for the fighter bombers. And on the way back, then we were at Ciampino North. And on the way back, we understood that on the radio that the 47s had a field day with us, whatever was on the ground, and they were strafing the place. And we came from several thousand feet height advantage, and we went right into them. And I remember this 147 was right in front of me, and he was just getting ready to strafe the field, and he didn't even bother to look around. I was pretty close behind him, and I went not more than maybe 100 feet. And I started to fire. And he didn't burn. He didn't do anything other than to cut power and go on the belly at a very high speed at the airport. He went through the airport. He came out on the other side, went to a cemetery, went to a chapel, took a chapel with him on the other side, and there he stood. When I landed then, I went over and had a look, and a fellow was sitting on the cowling smoking a cigarette, minus the wings. So you can imagine what this aircraft could take. Unbelievable. The 109 would have blown up as soon as I would have gotten hit. He actually took this hitting, because obviously I hit him in the engine, or he wouldn't have belly landed. The power was gone. He belly landed the airplane. He skid all over, went to the cemetery, took the wings off, and sat on the cowling smoking a cigarette. So that convinced me, boy, there was more to aircraft constructions than what we knew.
How about the time you were shot down behind the Russian lines?
Well, if I would like to tell you that story, but I'm afraid it's probably going to be too long, and I'll probably bother you. If you want to hear it, I tell it to you. Would you? Okay, we were in the Budapest area. The Russians were on the other side. Budapest is, the Danube goes through, and one part is Buda and the other is Pest. We were north of the Danube, and just for a short time, we tangled with the Russians there. The Russians, by the way, they were precluded from high altitude fighting because they had no oxygen. And at that time, they also were very poor on RT equipment. They couldn't communicate. They communicated in a way, and we caught that in the morning because by RT, the information was given to those squadrons of what the ID code would be. And we, of course, knew that. It was sometimes dipping the left wing twice, dipping the right wings once, this type of thing. Very crude, even in 44. And so we went out in the morning, and 4 airplanes went out in the morning, and they had to sort of sit around in pin tents. It was cold, and had to wait if there was something to do. And what was mostly to do was to look for weather conditions in the target area, so dive bombers could go and destroy a bridge, this type of thing. And they had to fly escort. So my turn wasn't that I was supposed to go out. But all of a sudden I got woke up, and they say, you have to go out. Somebody got sick or whatever it was. And I went out, and sure enough, the phone rang, and they wanted me to check the weather in this particular quadrant to see what it was like, so the fighter bombers could go. The other 3 people were sleeping, so I took just one, and we 2 took off. And the field was grass. It had was frozen overnight. There were water puddles around, and which you couldn't see because there was light snow that fell on top. And my other fellow took off first. He had the position lights on, and fell in one of those puddles at just about liftoff speed, went on the back and blew up. So a tremendous ball of fire. And I thought, well, that day starts off nice. But I took off, and I had the same problem. I was just mushing along to this stuff. I even had a belly tank on, next to a fuel tank. And I got airborne. I turned the position lights off, went around the field, and asked for somebody else to come up. So, because the fighter pilot by himself is lost, so you have to have 2. So they came up. That went uneventful. We climbed through the overcast, And sure enough, there were two Russians at about, the sun was just up, probably around 6,000, 7,000 meters. And they were doing the same thing. And I could see them. And they saw me, obviously, because I came from the dark side, and they were coming out of the sun. So I turned around, I overtook him a little bit and looked at him, and I could see those great big red stars, and they were Yak 9s, red painted nose. And I told my wingman, we'll drop the tanks and I'll attack him, and he should stay up there and watch and see what happened. So I went on the back, I dropped the tank, went very fast, dropped the tank, went on the back and attacked him. Well, he went on the back and his tank didn't come loose because he had still the tank on by the time he had pulled some G's, and the tank went sideways. I went down, I noticed that just a little later, and went after the Russian. He flew straight. I approached him from about 20 degrees from the back, and I had overspeed and close on him very fast. And he looked around, he dipped the wing twice, I dipped my wing twice, he leveled off and flew straight. At that time, I closed on pretty fast. Then he pulled a very steep turn. He thought there was something fishy. He pulled a very steep turn, I turned one, and he saw my black crosses, and you could have seen, I could have seen this fellow of how nervous he all of a sudden got. He just leveled off and dipped his wing twice once more. Of course, I was that close at that time, and he just fell out of the sky. He didn't even bother to bail out. The other one went looping all the way down through the overcast and disappeared. My wingman, with his crosswise belly tank, I had told to go home because he was of no use then anymore, and that was my second mistake. Should have never done that. I went down through the overcast to see what had happened to the other Russian. By the time I came down, it was slightly snowing, was still a little dark, and I saw a variety of airplanes with position lights on. Those were Russian dive bombers going back to their base. And at that time, we had already approached the Russian front, and we were over that. And then I made another mistake. I thought I'd join them. What can you say with 20 years? I put my position lights out and went after them. They went around this field, they dropped their gear, so did I. I looked and I saw a B-24 on the ground, apparently a liaison airplane that came that at that time made various trips between Russia and the West 4 and back. And I thought this airplane isn't going to go back home. And I made the third mistake. I attacked it. Of course, I pushed my gear back in again, turned my position lights off, shut down at this airplane, and my ammunition went right in front of it, nothing hit the airplane. By that time it was so low I had to pull over it, went around, and again the devil had me. I made again once more around. And by that time the Russians had woken up. I approached the airfield and they had opened up with the quadruple 20s on each corner. And it was just like Christmas. You wouldn't believe the beauty of what I saw. Green, red, blue, everything at me. A big bang on the right side, my right wingtip came off. I went over the field. B-24 got away, of course I didn't do anything with that one. And then it occurred to me to head west and to see what I could do with this aircraft. I came back over the Danube, and by that time they had sent fighters after me, and 4 MiGs attacked me. Typically in a way they had learned in school. All I had to do, of course, I flew sideways with this wingtip off, but I could control the aircraft. They came down, they set up on top of me, and one after another came down and attacked me and peeled off, just like you were told in school. Every time they came around, I looked around, I looked in their muzzle. Whenever I saw a fire come out, I pushed the rudder, went sideways, and it went underneath. Each time. Except number 4. He got smart. By the time I was in this position, he came down and hit me in front. And I got hit in the engine, actually in the canopy. And I got rid of the canopy and bailed out at not more than 200 feet, I would imagine. The chute opened, and I hit the floor. By doing that, when the chute opened, I lost my boot. I had a felt boot, which were very comfortable. And I lost that boot. I went down. The aircraft went a little further and exploded on a hillside. And there I sat. The evening before, we had a little party, and I had pajamas under my flight suit. And it was winter time, and I'd lost my felt boot. So I took a piece of the parachute and wrapped it around because it hurt, and you can still see it today. That's the only wound that I ever got during this war, and it's still there. A while later, not much longer than about half an hour or so, I had dug me a hole in the snow, put the parachute on top, and waited, because there was a village on one side, and I thought something is going to happen. Sure enough, there came a couple of motorcycles that had sidecars on. At that time, the airplane had burned pretty fiercely, and ammunition was going off, and I sat in my little hole, and those 2 motorcycles with those sidecars, and there were 4 people in it, they came up, and it was light enough that I could see that they were Russians. They had a red star on their fur helmet. But what I could also see was that since it was snowing a little bit, they had the rifle upside down. So I felt they wouldn't do that, to have the rifle upside down if they knew that there was somebody around. And they felt they didn't see me jumping because the time that expires was second by the time I jumped and the chute opened, that they felt I was in this wreck there. So they went around twice, took off and went back down again in that village. And I walked and saw nobody during this whole day. And of course my foot became on the lower part just as big as it was on the upper part. And I was hungry, I was thirsty, and I was almost freezing to death with my pajamas underneath my flight suit. So in the evening I felt I had to do something, and I came up to a little hill, and it was a forest area, and I was just looking at that village down the valley when I heard this rumbling of tanks. And there were 2 of them. And after a while I saw them, and they came up that hill. They had no identification, huge monsters, and I couldn't identify them. I didn't have a clue of what type of tanks they were, or who they belonged to, but they were big. And then they came up, stopped, the big barrel went around, they held it down in that village, and bang, there went the shell down and hit one of those houses. So it could have been either that the German was occupying the village and they were Russians, or the other way around. So I felt I had to do something, and I jumped up on the back of this tank and screamed in, "Who are you?" Because the forest was right behind me. All I had to do, by the time they turned that machine gun around, I would have been back in the forest. But action happened so fast that lid flew open. I don't know what this lid was. Maybe I was standing right next to it. I didn't know the tank. The lid flew open. Somebody stuck a short machine pistol in my stomach and said in good German, "Come on in, we're waiting." Can you imagine that? I got in the tank. I told them what had happened. They gave me a bottle of rum, a couple of blankets, and it took them all night before I got back again to our lines. So I was in no man's land. So there again. Things happen. Anyway. Any technical questions?
Are you familiar with what happened with the 100th Bomb Group?
With the 100th Bomb Group, I heard about it, but I can't say that I'm familiar.
Well, this is when the 100th Bomb Group had a plane that was in distress, and they went over the landing gear. Two German fighters came in on either side.
And let him go.
Top turret guard
I heard about
shot
it.
them down.
Mm-hmm.
Well, on subsequent missions, if you flew with the 100, it was like insurance.
Mm-hmm.
The German
Yeah.
fighters would go right past us and go
Yeah,
to the 100.
there was quite a bit of chivalry. I would think, and I heard stories, but I had never seen and never heard that anybody in the Western area ever shot at anybody on a parachute, regardless of what you might have read. It was not true. I had never seen that. So, or I would have heard it, I'm sure. But this was never the case. So it was still, although this war was of catastrophic dimensions, as everybody can tell who was in it. For us, it was devilish. And in the morning, you always were afraid, every day, of whether you were alive again in the evening or not. And the chances were that you were not, one way or another. So I take my hat off everybody that wasn't at war. And whatever they did, they did their best. I don't think from today's youth we could expect anything that what you people had done in your age and your time in history. I don't think it could be asked today from today's youths. I might be mistaken, but
No, I suspect you're right, Hans. As we had mentioned in our conversation earlier, there is in the profession of arms, and especially in combat, a bond that develops between people who have shared a common experience. And I am sure that the experiences and the feelings that you experienced in the transitory nature of life at the time, you're alive today, who knows what tomorrow will bring, is much the same experience that so many of the combat veterans here have experienced. You mentioned Monte Cassino and the difficulty. At the receiving end was the 10th Mountain Division, who was assaulting Monte Cassino, and one of the very distinguished alumni of Monte Cassino and the 10th Mountain Division is our Senator Bob Dole, the senator from Kansas, and he tells very interesting stories about Monte Cassino. He was very severely wounded in Monte Cassino, and if you'll notice him on TV now, his right hand is clenched, and he always carries a pen in the clenched hand, and he always covers it with his left hand, and he stands very often facing the group or addressing the group or talking to the group with his left hand over the right, and that, of course, is the war wound that he received during the assault of Monte Cassino, and he has very vivid memories, and among veterans is willing to talk about them, so he's really quite a guy. Hans, I really want to thank you for an absolutely incredible narrative and account of your experiences, which are so unique. And I think that all of us are privileged to have heard that and to spend an evening of comradeship with you.
Thank you.
We want to thank you for that, and also we'd like to present you with a mug, a distinguished guest speaker's mug for the Military Order of the World Wars, and put it on your mantelpiece.
Yes, sir, I sure
have
will.
a beer from it, or
I
keep
will.
pencils in it, and it's a real pleasure.
Thank you very much.
So thank you once again.